All right, meditation 5, meditation 6. Descartes is now confident that he can make some knowledge claims and that he understands a little bit better what his mind is that's supposed to be doing the knowing, that's supposed to get him access to reality in some way or other. Interesting that what he ends up coming up with feels very, very much like Plato in a lot of ways. It is very much like Plato in a lot of ways. At a certain point, he asks us to think about triangles having three sides, or the three angles of the triangle adding up to 180 degrees. And he says, well, look, even if no body existed, even if there if there were no physical world at all, it would still be true that the three angles of the triangle add up to be two right angles. So these are facts about something, right? So directing us towards a realm of fact, directing us towards truths that can be known without the senses, even these geometric truths. And then throughout the sixth meditation, he ends up arguing that, hey, we can trust the senses sometimes, but not all the time. And some of the things that the senses tell us are going to be faulty, or maybe not faulty, but properly speaking, facts about our experience, not facts about the way things are. Anyway, so that's the big picture here. We are replacing Aristotle in metaphysics with something much more like Plato or Augustine, which is in a way a simplification, but it also has that dualism to discuss. Anyway, anything that we wanted to comment on before jumping into talking about the ontological argument in particular? All right. Jump in when you feel like it. The ontological argument. The presentation of this is backwards. Descartes starts by talking about the essence of material things and then moves to the ontological argument. But I want to talk about the ontological argument first, because then that gives us more continuity with the other subjects when we kind of put God behind us a little bit and start talking about the physical world. So the ontological argument, it's not one of the more popular arguments from the history of philosophy about the existence of God at this point. The philosophy that's been dominating the schools in Europe is very Aristotelian, very Thomistic. Thomas Aquinas argues about the ontological argument that, I mean, how he puts it is a little peculiar. It seems to be a valid conclusion, but not valid for us in a way, right? If you get access to the essence of God, you would see, Aquinas seems to think, you would see that existence follows from the essence of God, but not to us. We don't have such access to the nature of God. So it's a weird argument in that it doesn't start from creation, doesn't even start from the mind. It just begins with the very idea of a divine being. And the very idea of a divine being, according to Descartes and St. Anselm before him, is all you need to find that God exists. When Anselm approaches this, he approaches it at the essence of God as that than which a greater cannot be thought. This is a basis for perfect being theology. God is whatever it's better to be than not to be. Well, if God is whatever it's better to be than not to be, well, the idea of a non-existent God is going to be contradictory in some way. That's how the argument goes. Seeing how the contradiction arises, there are some various takes on this, but it's an interesting argument for sure. There are a lot of common critiques of ontological arguments, and it turns out a lot of the more famous of them are directed at Descartes' version. Descartes' version of this argument seems to be particularly bad, according to many. So Descartes identifies God as a being with all perfections. And then because it's better to be than not to be, because existence is a perfection, God must exist. There's a contradiction in imagining a being with all perfections as not existing. And it might strike us as a little bit of an unusual argument, as it feels like a rhetorical trick sometimes. Um, I'm not entirely sure that it's just a rhetorical trick. It does seem in some version to get you the idea that the existence of God is either a necessary truth, God necessarily exists, or the existence of God is contradictory. And that's interesting, right? While, unicorns exist, turns out to be false, it seems contingently false. There could have been unicorns with a slightly different timeline kind of thing. But whether God exists or not is not like whether unicorns exist or whether you and I exist. It is more, it's an all or nothing thing, modally speaking. It's either God exists, like God necessarily exists. The non-existence of God would be contradictory, like a square circle, or the existence of God is contradictory, like a square circle. So God is very, very different from unicorns in this regard, at least, right? Where unicorns could exist or could not exist, and it becomes, we realize the facts. For God, it's the other way around. God exists necessarily, or God does not exist necessarily. But either way, it's necessary, and that's peculiar. It is peculiar. Descartes says that this is peculiar to God to have this property of existing necessarily.
Joe, I have
Peculiar.
a question.
Yeah.
Descartes seems to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, he seems to be saying that because we can imagine God being the most good, that that means that God exists because we can't have a summation that's bigger than its parts, more or less. Am I that part? I think maybe went over my head a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So the argument here, it's kind of funny. It starts with the concepts, right? Like almost, like pi. If one were to define pi and then wonder, where would we find pi in nature? Like, what is pi? And find pi as a right. If we identified pi first as the ratio, then all these other properties we could kind of discover in pi, and then other ratios we could discover, oh, that's not pi at all. So we kind of set up the litmus test, right? So we don't begin by saying, okay, is there a God? Is there not a God? And what would that God be like? We start with what would that God be like? And then we go to ask what happens. So if God is, by definition, the superlative being, by definition, whatever it's better to be than not to be, then we then can ask, okay, is it possible for such a being not to exist? And Descartes' going to say no, because it's better to be than not to be, and God is a being with all perfections. So non-existence, right, in the same way that understanding a right triangle really clearly shows you the Pythagorean theorem. In the same way, understanding what we mean by God is supposed to get you that God exists, right? Because of the superlative nature, right? Because God not having this property would be a contradiction in terms. In Anselm, I like the way he approaches omnipotence, actually, really well. So Anselm's Proslogion, it's a very little book, but it's got like 90 chapters or something, and so many of them are this attribute of God, this perfection that belongs to God, and so on. But they're all defined by God being that than which a greater cannot be thought. So if we take this concept, that than which a greater cannot be thought. Now, first, if someone tells you that they're thinking of something greater than that than which a greater cannot be thought, you see that they're lying instantly, right? By definition, there's nothing greater than that than which a greater cannot be thought. By definition, you can't think of something greater than that than which a greater cannot be thought. So let's start with this question. Could that than which a greater cannot be thought, could this essence be something with limited power? Well, clearly not, because if that than which a greater cannot be thought has limited power, you could imagine something even greater. But you can't imagine anything greater than that than which a greater cannot be thought. So that than which a greater cannot be thought must have unlimited power. And then you go through other properties too and find, okay, God must, be everywhere, not confined to one body or one location. So God must be like spirit. God seems to be so it's not an anthropomorph. Well, it is anthropomorphized, but I mean we have very little choice about that, right? But if you imagine, uh, rocks and worms and frogs and kind of climb up this platonic scale of complexity and perfection, and imagine, the psychology of a rock versus the psychology of a frog versus the psychology of a human. uh, I think Anselm would say that from there we'd find God to be more than the psychology of a human, not closer to the psychology of a rock or something like that. So we try to like build all these perfections in them. Are some of them, skewed by uh, you know, us thinking too highly of ourselves? Probably, yeah. But we try to build these in there, and then, oh, what about existence? Well, if it didn't exist, you could imagine something greater, like the same thing but existing. Okay, so that's the argument. It is this weird kind of you start with the idea and then find that that idea has to represent a thing that's real. Is it viable as an argument? Some are going to say no, it doesn't work at all. One of Descartes' objectors. Now, I think I told you this. Let me tell you in a little bit more detail. When Descartes writes the Meditations, he sends the draft to a series of 6 or 7, depending on how one counts, 6 or 7 commenters to get some feedback. I mean, what does publishing look like, especially when you're, so he sends it around. So he sends it to one group, and then he writes a response. Sends it to another group, and gets some objections and writes a response. So they build on each other, and the later objectors have the advantage of the comments to the others. So it's actually rather interesting, rather engaging. But this right off the bat, it's the first objector says this argument, this ontological argument for the existence of God, like we all know this isn't a very good argument, right? So why are you bringing it up, basically? Um, After all, Thomas Aquinas already objects, but let's put it this way: what if you're saying that because God has to have all these features essentially, then God essentially is a being with all perfections, then this idea, this concept has to essentially exist, because existence is part of his essence, right? So if the existence of God is part of the essence of God, part of the concept of God, then can't we think of some other seemingly fictional entity that has existence as part of its nature, and then find that it really exists? So, oh, and I forget the name of this commentary. Here we go. Yeah, Johann Decatur, or Caterus in Latin. Cat. That's nice. Anyway, Johann Decatur, Johannes Caterus says, let's invent this new being, an idea in our mind of the existing lion, not a normal lion, not a regular old lion, the existing lion. Now, what's so special about the existing lion? Well, like ordinary lions, it's got all the normal lion features, but unlike the ordinary lions, this one has an extra feature, and it has it essentially. It exists, right? Existence is part of its essence. And so, uh, if the existing lion exists in your mind, right? If you can think the existing lion, then you should see very clearly that the existing lion exists. That's the objection. That's a pretty strong objection. Um, it's quite similar actually to Kant's objection, and Kant says that it's basically the same thing. Kant says existence isn't a predicate; it's not a property that you imagine being added to a concept. It's a quantifier. It says that there is some, right. So it's quite different. Um, there's another objection that's worth bringing up, but we could probably bring skip past that one for now. Okay, Joseph, what you got here? Would that idea be the reason that the Christian Bible has the transition from the Old Testament to the New, like the idea that Christ is being the embodiment of God, would set our ability to see our own metaphysical comparison to reality and our abilities in it? Hmm. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think this the ontological argument is only as old as like 12th century. Uh, of the traditional arguments for the existence of God, the design arguments, cosmological argument, this one seems to be the latest. Um, but we found in our Plato readings that Plato develops a perfect being theology from a different angle, from a pragmatic angle. He says, what kind of stories about the gods are most appropriate for our city? We shouldn't be doing the kind of things that Homer's doing, describing the gods as, warring and lusting and whatever, right? Gods doing despicable things. We need the gods that we should aspire to, gods that define virtue for us, gods that always behave, act nobly, and never, with these baser human instincts and such. So you could approach perfect being theology, interestingly, from this kind of ontological angle, seeing this as a proof of the sort of thing that religions describe, or from a pragmatic angle of what's good for us as humans, right? How should we think of God as humans? Um, Interesting thing about bringing the Bible into it is the Bible has like overtly competing descriptions of God. Um, the story of Abraham on Sinai is God shows Abraham. No, this is Moses. Sorry, Moses on Sinai. God shows Moses his butt, and it seems rather strange because Moses asks to see God's face, and God says, "No, you can't see my face." He doesn't say, "I don't have a face." He says, "You can't see my face." So we're already like figuring out if we're following a biblical account to like understand God. We're already figuring out in what way to take these different descriptions of God, what to do with them, which to explain away and which not. Perfect being theology is, I think, a rather nice way to approach that. Um, in some ways. I don't know. I've come to see it as tied with purity culture in my mind, and even white supremacy. Um, uh, but yeah, that's a tricky thing. We're comparing ourselves to the ultimate being. Okay, so this question says, would comparing ourselves to the ultimate being bottleneck our own confidence in our abilities? It's interesting. I mean, I think part of the reason for it, part of the benefit, the kind of anthropological and social benefit of thinking about a perfect being or a divine being, um, is to give us some security in our own self. Uh, to in God we have energy. In God we can, and that's kind of why I like thinking of uh, fictional theologies and what they do for us. I've been really thinking a lot about Thra in Dark Crystal as this kind of pantheistic understanding uh, of where providence comes from, of where having like spiritual practices and rituals surrounding death that not only help us to understand death and not cower from it entirely, and certainly to not be a skepsis and try to like grasp immortality at the expense of those around you. A lesson that our oligarchs need to hear over and over again. But yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. Here, Descartes definitely sees God as essential for knowing at all, right? Essential for coming to any truth of things. If you don't know where your mind came from, why would you have any uh, confidence that it's giving you anything other than delusion? So Descartes approaches that by saying, well, God gives me the mind, and then I know that when I'm using it properly, at least I get some truth. Okay, that. Well, I suppose the one other objection I think is really interesting to talk about ontological arguments is called Leibniz's objection, but it's not entirely an objection. Leibniz says there's actually nothing wrong with the ontological argument. You just have to first prove that the existence of God is possible, which goes back to what we were saying before. If the existence of God is either necessarily true or necessarily false, if you prove that it's possible, then it has to be true. So you need to see clearly, kind of like Aquinas says, you need to see clearly that there's no contradiction, that we have the essence of God as a being with all perfections or something, and then you can finish the argument that way. How do we get that? Leibniz thought he had an idea about all these different properties. If you bump them up to 100, there can't be any contradiction between them because there's no negation in them. It's a little funny, but there might be something there. I don't know. But even in like Alan Plantinga's God, Freedom, and Evil, he gives a version of the ontological argument that is thoughtful and does a good job responding to objections, but the conclusion is mitigated quite a bit because you can't just say, okay, so now we know that God exists. It's no, if God is possible, then God exists. That's as close as we're going to get with something like that. Okay, essence of material things. This goes really easily, but it's the big point, I think. Descartes is a mechanist. He says, even without knowing if these ideas of material things presented to me are representing real things that exist outside of the mind, what is it, right? What is the idea of a material thing? What is common to all material things and essential in that if I removed that property, I removed the material thing altogether? And his answer is extension, taking up three-dimensional space, right? Size, shape, motion, and rest. That's what it is to be a physical thing, to be a material thing, is to have size, shape, and some degree of motion or rest, and that's it. So Descartes, his account of the physical world, as much as, paying attention to the dualism makes us feel like there's all this supernatural stuff going on, his account of the material world is stripped down to physical bodies, stripped down to things that take up space, billiard balls. And we said about meditation before, billiard balls acting by efficient causation, right? By contact. Um, they've gotten rid of substantial forms except for the human soul, because we can't just explain. He has no way of explaining how pure intellection works. Uh, when you know things about a chiliagon, it doesn't have anything to do, right? A thousand-sided figure. You can't distinguish that in the imagination between a circle and a chiliagon, but you know facts about the chiliagon, even though you can't picture it. The facts you know about the chiliagon, I mean, I would know these facts if I was any good at geometry. The facts about the chiliagon are true, but they don't have anything to do with the imagination. They have nothing to do with actually the way you engage with the physical world. You do it entirely from the armchair. So you can't eliminate the mind, but he's eliminated all the other substantial forms. He's reduced metaphysics down into something that's analyzable by physics, by modern physics. This is why he's father of modern philosophy, as we say. Okay, so material things, they take up space. And since they're taking up space, they're also mobile. All right. Then in the sixth meditation, we start to get access to the physical world. We find that it's still limited. How do we know that there is a physical world out there? Basically, so he's already set us up to say that conceptual analysis works, right? We can rely on our understanding. We rely on our reasoning. But that's not the senses, right? That's conceptual analysis. If I see very clearly that this predicate belongs to this subject, then I can affirm that subject is predicate or whatever, right? But the senses, he's still like not sure. He's still playing the Platonic line of, I know that these things are useful for giving me information about the world. They're practically useful, what the senses tell us. And that's true whether this room really exists or if it only exists in my mind. It's still practically useful. So how do we know that the world exists? Well, we need a further principle. It's not just this that reason will tell us, that a conceptual analysis will discover that the physical world exists. We need an extra step, and that is, well, look, it is such a natural belief for me, given the way that my imagination and my sensation operates, given the way I experience the physical world through sensation. I mean, if we think of sensation, and definitely through imagination. If the physical world weren't there, right, I have such a strong impulse to believe it. And if I was wrong, I would still believe I was right. I'm going to believe in the physical world no matter what. I cannot make myself keep skeptical about the physical world. Not really. So, I mean, there's idealists that we could talk about. That's fun, but not really, right? I mean, we're living in the physical world, whether it's real or not. So, if it's not real, but we've been so made with such impulse to believe it and no way to correct that impulse, then God would be a deceiver, right? Now that's not true about everything, right? I could find that, oh, this was a dream. This was a real vivid dream. And I thought I was sitting in that chair and looking at the other one, but turned out I was in bed. That doesn't make God a liar. That's fine. I have a way of correcting that. And I could even maybe, well, let's not. I could make myself doubt, but I could wake myself up if it was false, right? I'm not doomed to be stuck in the falsehood uh, if it weren't for it being true. So that's how he knows that there is a world. That's how he knows that these physical things that he's decided have size, shape, motion, and rest uh, actually exist in the physical world. But they are not quite exactly what our senses present them to be. There is a distinction that comes to be called the primary secondary quality distinction. I think it's given those names in John Locke and maybe not before, but it appears here in Descartes and also appears earlier in Galileo. Um, the primary qualities are physical. So when we look at this blue book, the primary qualities are the extension and the motion, the size, shape, and motion and rest. That is what's really there of this book out there in the physical world. There's other things, though, that I attribute to this book. Now, so whatever belongs to extension, motion is actually an interesting one to think about. Descartes has a really odd understanding of what motion and rest really are, which is fun. But so whatever can be explicated in terms of extension in the book, yeah, that's really there in the physical world. But there's more than that. This book doesn't have a particularly strong smell, but it does have a smell. Um, it's got this blue color with some yellow and white. Yellow and white. Heck, wait, yellow off blue and white. These features of it, and in fact, the texture as well, they don't exist in the book. Not in the book in the physical world, the outside book. They exist in the book as I perceive it. So it's not very surprising about color. After all, let's see. If you pay very close attention to the particular shade of blue, you find that it's different depending on the lighting. So which one is the true color, right? Which shade of blue is it really? And I mean, actually, the knee jerk that we have now of talking about color as light and is reflecting off, that all fits here really nicely, right? Light is a physical thing. Light moves through the physical world, has properties, has different bandwidth. That's a motion. And those bandwidths interact with the book and interact with the eye in particular in a certain way that generates. Of course, Descartes can't get to generate here. That's like he's still trying to be very careful, right? That's only going to be probable stuff. Um, but it generates, right? The light hitting the eye generates an experience of blue. But the blue isn't really in the book. What's in the book is size, shape, motion, and rest, and light isn't really blue. Light isn't the property of blue, the color blue. Light is light, and it moves with different bandwidths, and those bandwidths interact with things in different ways. Motion, right? And give you different perceptions. Same with texture, right? Smooth isn't in the book. Uh, there is a topographical kind of texture that you could describe as like not very bumpy, right? Bumpy belongs to the book, bumpy or not bumpy, but silky smooth. That's in the experience of it, the smell of things, right? Smells are in the experience. Sounds are in experience. Right? If a tree falls and there's no one to hear it, no, it's vibrations in the air. Sure, those are happening. That's size, shape, motion, and rest. but it has to be perceived to be a sound. So that's the kind of stuff that Descartes is going on. Extension and motion exist in the physical world, and then all of these other qualities about texture, smell, color, um, sound, pleasure and pain. Right? Pleasure and pain don't exist in the body; they exist in the experience of the body, which is weird, right? But he illustrates this with and some points he's making about dualism. He illustrates this with the phantom limb syndrome. So I mean, you imagine a corpse, and you put a pin in the corpse, separate the flesh. There's no pain. Um, Even though the body's there, there's no pain. Even though the physical thing's happening, there's no pain. But you could take someone who is missing a limb, and they will feel pain even when the limb's not there, right? And Descartes has an explanation of it. Of usually a pain here activates some nerves, which he thinks of as being kind of a pulley system. Activates some nerves here, here, here. So there's this trail of nerves, and if this one's agitated like it would have been when pain is introduced here, then you will get the same sensation, even though that part of the arm isn't there. You'll still identify, you'll still locate it in that same spot. So pain and pleasure also belong to the body. Now, Descartes isn't your physical trainer. Just because pain is in the mind doesn't mean you can just turn it off. These things are real, but where are they located, right? Are they mental or are they physical? And that's the big division that Descartes has here between the mental and the physical. Now, he still has to prove his dualism. And this the last thing we should talk about. We're moving at a pretty nice clip. Let me clear the board. And you got anything, Matt or Joseph, that you want to interject?
Yeah, I was kind of thinking, it was interesting how he was talking about the yeah, like you said, the pulley system where like pain is more perception in the mind. And then I think he kind of goes on to see the mind is different than the body, because even though you experience pain in your hand, someone could have this phantom pain and experienced in the brain that way. And I don't personally, I don't know if I agree with that. I think that would point more to the unified nature of the body, but I guess maybe that's up for discussion.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. And I had also just been watching Severance, where the people
My
kind
son
of
is watching that too. He was just telling us
Jekyll.
about.
Yeah, I just finished season one, and that's the one where people kind of Jekyll and Hyde themselves so that their work self is a different person from their home self.
Sounds trippy.
But really, they have no idea what either of them are doing. It's interesting, but the idea that like in the elevator when you switch from one to the other, that you can leave behind the trauma. I would have believed that in my 20s, I think, but not as a 40-year-old. No, the mind is so thoroughly intertwined, at least, right? Intertwined at least. Okay, so Descartes, he says both things, which is convenient, but he says at one point that the mind and the body is not like the sailor in the ship. There's a real unity, there's a real intermingling between the two. But they are different, and they are really different. Now, really different actually needs some qualifications of its own. There are different kinds of distinctions. Isn't that delightful, of philosophers? There's a distinction of reason. The distinction of reason says that though we think of them as two things, they're really one thing, right? So Clark Kent and Superman are really the same, but Superman doesn't wear glasses, and Clark Kent can't, leap over buildings in a single bounce, right? So even though they're really the same, they're two ideas representing the same thing. So that's a distinction of reason. Your mind thinks of them differently. Then there's the modal distinction, and this seems to be, well, I mean, not opine about it, the modal distinction too much, but the relationship between blue and the book here, right? The book could exist without being the color blue. I could color it. But you don't just, I can't pull the blue off and like, see, I've got blue here now, right? Blue is a mode, it's a property of the thing. So that's the modal distinction, the distinction between a thing and its properties, perhaps, or between one property and another, perhaps. Descartes says it's the real distinction. It's not a modal distinction between mind and body. And if you think that the mind is the brain, or the mind is like the program that the brain is running, then you might think there's a modal distinction between mind and brain, or maybe the mind is like a property of the brain or something. But no, Descartes says real distinction. This is one thing, this is another thing. And the way he argues for it most clearly involves God, in maybe a bit of an uncomfortable way here. But if we understand very clearly that the essence of the mind is to be a thinking thing, right? I mean, if it's not thinking, it's not a mind. And if it is thinking, it is a mind, right? If there's a disembodied, if that's even possible, a disembodied uh, locus of thought, we call that a mind, for sure. Um, and we know that bodies, including the human body, including my particular human body, it's extension and motion. It's size, shape, motion. So knowing very clearly what it is to be a body, knowing very clearly what it is to be a brain, not a brain, a mind, a thinking thing, uh, thought and extension. My idea of thought and extension, they're not related. I can pull these apart in my mind, right? I could imagine a thinking unextended thing, and I could imagine an extended unthinking thing. There's lots of those. Some of them look like humans. But since thought and extension are so clearly different, and they are essential to the mind and essential to the body, respectively, then at least God's omnipotent power could separate them. And if they're separable, then they're really distinct. They're really two different things. Now, is Descartes' mind, Descartes' brain, it, more than a ship and a captain, is what he says. Does that offer a whole lot? There's an intermingling, and he does seem to think that the composite of mind and body has more to it than the mind has on its own and the body has on its own. You don't get, for instance, the imagination unless there's both. He just now when he's breaking from his certainty train when he says this, but it seems to him at the beginning of the sixth meditation that the imagination is in some way physical, and the sense is some way physical, right? And that's part of the grist of the I can't but believe in these physical things. So it seems quite natural then to think of thought, pure intellection, as a non-physical thing, as a non-physical thing that we do. And so something that potentially could continue to do, to be after the body dies or separate from the body. But it's also very clear that much of what we do is bodily. And actually, in Descartes' Passions of the Soul, he gives a big account, and also in Lum, Treatise on Man. The Treatise on Man gives an account of the human being minus the soul, and you'd be amazed what it could do. Walk around, talk, and everything. And then in the Passions of the Soul, he describes the way in which the body even will react to things, right? A rabbit, which Descartes thinks is none of this, right? It's just some of this, and there's imagination perhaps, there's experience perhaps, but it's a little different. The rabbit, when he sees the lion about to pounce, moves, right? And for Descartes, a human uh, doesn't need to stop and contemplate that there's a lion approaching, but like the body will run away on its own. You don't have to worry about that. Um, anyway, and there's other philosophers that take this in different directions. Anton Amo says that um, the first Black European philosopher, Anton Amo, thinks that the body can't be. I'm sorry, the mind can't be passive at all. The mind is purely active and the body is purely passive, and so the body can't even communicate anything to the mind. It gets fun, it gets weird. Anyway, so yeah, Descartes thinks they're intermingled, and the intermingling is something different, and that's something we should talk about separately. I think our next stop is to look at a couple objections to Descartes, coming from Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia and from Margaret Cavendish. And then we'll also circle back to Anne Conway after we read Spinoza and see some responses there too. Object permanence. So which part? Let's see. I see our mind is the collection and pattern of our entire existence, and the body is evolving to keep up, but the interconnection between the two inner DNA isn't something we can condense into understanding yet, because one relies on external progression, which naturally builds the reasons that. Yeah, interesting. There is something about the place of habit in Descartes earlier on, right? It's nature tells you that grumbling in your stomach means you should eat, right? That those things should be, linked. Why should they be linked, right? I mean, that's something we have to discover through our own experience. So yeah, it is. It's interesting how Descartes is building. And I know, Joseph, I think I'm moving a little bit adjacent to your questions here, but I think this is the best thing I have to say in this arena. So sorry if it's not quite quite an answer to your questions. Some of them are just a lot bigger than Descartes, and uh, but we'll do that. We'll do that in other times. But Descartes sees knowledge as a tree. I don't know if I can get all the branches here, but there's some kind of like method and meditations happening down here. And then is metaphysics even in the roots? I forget. And then I think physics is actually the trunk of the tree. And then you get branches of these practical disciplines of, let's see, I think it's going to be medicine, engineering maybe, and law. I don't remember. But the idea is, you can only keep up this certainty for so long, right? This is for the foundational stuff. Now it would be great if we really could maintain that to build this coherent body of truth. I think that is the way a lot of people see science, as like, well, once we've established something, like we'd established something in geometry, we just get the next thing, and then the next thing and the next thing, and if we can keep out the bullshit, and keep a proper catalog of all the discoveries that we've made. Discoveries, right? This feels very explorer, colonial kind of look, and look what we're building for everyone, right? If we can keep it pure of the bullshit and just keep building all the discoveries that we made, then we'll really, have something there. But even if you are on board with the foundationalist project of, let's see what we can know with certainty and then build as much certainty as we can, we're going to run out. I mean, maybe not run out exactly, right? You can keep doing geometry for a very, very long time. But as you try to progress into other disciplines, you're going to run out. You're going to run out of certainty, especially when you start like looking at the human body and what's this doing here and what's that doing there. Bodies are different, so, and your investigations start really requiring the senses, which are only going to get you useful truths. I mean, not even the essence of things. It's usually, usually the twitch in my stomach means I should eat, but sometimes it really means I shouldn't. So it takes balancing of probabilities, even if you're like Descartes, to start engaging in what to do history at all, right? You're relying on testimony, and their testimony is not at all like this. So this kind of plan for science, this view of science is something that you can grow if you have the right foundations. And what's really interesting about Descartes is just how much he accomplished actually in like wiping out old foundations and establishing something new. Um, the substance mode ontology that he starts giving. I mean, he's not the first to come up with it. Apparently, David Gorlaeus is the first to really talk about substance and mode as like the main categories for understanding physical things at a metaphysical level. There's the things, and then there are modifications. We'll see more of that in Spinoza. But yeah, we had like form and matter, but we don't really want to talk about form and matter anymore. We want to talk about substances and their attributes and their modifications, their modes. So anyway, so it's really interesting that in the generation after Descartes, people are identifying themselves as Cartesians and being punished for it too, right? But it takes off, and then when Newton is putting out his physics, it very much starts with critiques of the Cartesian stuff that came before. He doesn't have to go and dismantle Aristotle because that work's been done already. So yeah, there's a lot of ways in which we're all Cartesians in some way or other. But then what else is there? And especially if we get off of the certainty train at the second meditation, then it's like, oh well, we never really get certainty back, and we have to engage with probabilities and diverse perspectives on the same reality, and the Platonic dialectic of you kind of scurry your way from truth that seems like it's going to hold up to scrutiny to truth that seems a little better to hold up to scrutiny, and kind of approach reality that way. All right, I think that is where I intend to stop. Um, but if you got a little more to say, we can talk a bit more. But I'm looking forward to moving on and looking closely at Spinoza. But uh, that's tough. I need to share some scans as well. So I'll get that sorted tomorrow. I'll probably just link it into the syllabus as a Google Doc. Should be pretty straightforward. All right.
Yeah, I was actually thought that what Joe had said was pretty interesting. Specifically, he said the part unsure if we actually think willingly. It's kind of brings up a really interesting line of thinking about whether or not we actually have free will or not. And
Yeah.
I thought the places I feel like I run up against these sort of questions are more with seems like biologists like to talk about this.
Mm.
The specifically about like being like simple structures are somewhat predictable, and so we have no reason to expect multiple simple structures stacked on top of each other, making a complex structure like a human, why that would not be somewhat predictable also. And um, how that, given the same circumstances and the same biology, the choices that we make are not really choices, and so much as just this is what we would do regardless, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't
Yeah. No, Descartes on freedom is it's a little funny. And some freedom is like a libertarian about free will, is you really got some control. Others don't see any place for that in Descartes, especially well, in his physics, all motion is really like directly from God.
right.
Uh, Physical things are purely passive, inert. The mind is supposed to be active, but not on the physical, really. Maybe, maybe the ability to redirect the the animal spirits as they flow through the brain, but he doesn't talk about that. He's like, no, there's
Right.
a connection, there's an intermingling, like the ship, not like the ship. We'll see a little more what he has to say about that, but yeah, can do you have power over your beliefs?
Mm,
Not, I mean, maybe not really.
yeah.
He seems to think that we have the power to restrain our judgments. We have the power to not leap to a conclusion, but that's maybe it. Um, if it seems like we don't have the power to not believe in the physical world, for instance. We don't have the power to believe that we don't exist. There's things we can doubt. Um, so we can restrain the will, but it also feels like you just have as many clear and distinct ideas as you do. Like it's you're born with that. God could have made you with a better mind that could perceive things more clearly, or just contains more clear and distinct ideas. But why didn't he? I don't know. Well, maybe he did that too, but that's just not you. Uh, which is
Surely
kind
it's
of,
not.
well, right. But does that, like, oh, why didn't God make me better? Does that console at all? No.
Yeah.
Like, well, yeah, God could have made someone just like you, but a little bit better. And maybe he did that too. Like,
Well, I wish I was better.
yeah, like, what, does that do anything for me? I mean,
Yeah, I mean that's
again,
a
there's the ego of it all. Like, you're dust. Like, you've got what you got. I mean, that makes sense of, why couldn't I have been a little bit more perfect of a creature, but not like, why is life so hard,
Yeah.
and why is my body betraying me in this way and not some less damaging way or something, those things. Uh, Freedom doesn't do anything. And, oh, maybe God made the better things too, doesn't really seem to make things better, especially if you're thinking in terms of a perfect being theology, right? Problem of
Yeah.
evil gets like 10 times worse. But the
Yeah.
more that your God is some mysterious uh, force in nature, like Spinoza's going to say, the more, God made what God made, and isn't it good? And the wouldn't have, the world couldn't be different than it is. The world couldn't be better. The world couldn't be worse. The world is what we've got, and would make ourselves miserable, and sometimes we'll find the misery unavoidable, I think. But we can also work towards blessedness.
It almost
Yeah.
feels like we're brushing up against a little bit of like divine hiddenness. Like if God could make us in any way, why didn't he make like an atheist's perception to perceive God like just past the threshold instead of like just under it? You know what I mean? Or
Yeah,
like
well,
a
that's why
lot
the way
above
I
it
was
instead of
brought up,
way.
it's oh, those atheists, if you only knew, they're refusing. I think, yeah, that's the
Oh,
way it was brought up. It's very, very bigoted,
presuppositionalist.
really. Uh, they do know. They're just choosing not to see. Blaise Pascal says there's enough light for those who want to see and enough darkness for those
Yeah,
who want not to see.
I had a
Um,
very
yeah, yeah, go ahead.
say I had a that um the atheists are choosing not to know that presuppositionalist. I actually had a fairly interesting conversation today about presuppositionalism. So
Oh,
uh,
yeah.
yeah, talking about actually I actually ended up bringing up the Euthyphro bit about it, like is like because a lot of presuppositionalists will say like, well, logic like comes from God. And I introduced the idea, does God love logic because it's good, or is it good because God loves it? So it's kind of,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
thought you might like that.
Is God rational, or
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah? It's good stuff.